Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. My name is Patricia Anderson, and I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I will be your producer today for this first Monday's webinar with PSG Consulting. As many of you are aware, we're using Zoom's webinar platform. That means we can't see or hear you, but you can see and hear us. We encourage you to engage with us in the Q&A. We'll get to as many questions as we possibly can, and we look forward to hearing from you in that forum. So with all of that, I'm going to turn it over to our host, Paige Gardner.
Thanks, Patricia, and welcome. Let me start by saying how much I appreciate and value everyone's attendance and participation in these webinars. And thank you to those taking the surveys. Your suggestions are really helpful, so keep them coming. The fabric of people's lives and their ability to shape their own futures and the health and well-being of their families is being increasingly determined in the states at all levels of government. Governors, state legislative bodies, school boards, county commissions, state courts, etc., are the centers of activities in many states to use punitive cultural conservatism to obtain power and enact agendas advanced by a virulent minority. Just at the state level, we have seen the following. In 2022, 430 bills were introduced in state legislatures to restrict abortion and reproductive rights. Too many states have enacted many types of voter restriction laws, book bans, new restrictions in the power of governors, prohibitions on so-called critical race theory, reductions in unemployment benefits, new child labor laws exploiting children and exposing them to hazardous jobs, silencing dissent, permitless gun laws. This is not just turning back the clock, this is destroying people's lives. However, there is some good news. Democracy and democratic institutions were strengthened in some states in 2022, and we are seeing a real pushback against increasing authoritarianism. We have several terrific panelists to address these topics. First, we will lead with Kim Hadow. Kim is the founder of the Local Solutions Support Center, an organization formed to counter the misuse of preemption, document its consequences, and strengthen local authority. She has a storied career as a communications expert and political consultant. I've worked with her in a variety of campaigns and at the Voter Participation Center. Next is Kim Rogers. Kim helped start as the first executive director of the Democratic Associations of Secretaries of State and its affiliated 501c4, Every Eligible American. She really built the association from the ground up and beat back election deniers in every battleground state. She is a brilliant strategist and a dedicated fighter for voting rights. Nancy Zdunkowicz is a pollster to Democratic candidates, nonprofits, party committees, and labor unions. She recently left Change Research to begin her own public opinion research firm, Z2A Research. She has extensive experience doing surveys for state legislative candidates and bodies. Make sure you catch her many videos on TikTok and other places. She really has a deep understanding of American voters and their reactions to current events. With that, I will turn it over to Kim. Oh, excuse me, I just saw Leader Reeves has joined us. So let me introduce the leader. He is the minority leader in the North Carolina House of Representatives. He's the Democratic leader of the House. He represents District 54, which includes Chatham County and portions of Randolph as well. He is an up-and-coming state leader who has made an outsized impact already. The state of North Carolina is a great example of the role of how the right is trying to flex its power and impose its views. Look at what's happened since the Supreme Court change. It's incredibly backwards leaning, and it's very scary in terms of what's happening in the state of North Carolina. And Leader Reeves will be able to tell us more about that. With that, I'll turn it over to Kim.
Thank you, Paige. I'm here today to give an overview of what's been going on with state legislatures this spring and over the last decade. And slide, and to tell you why we got to stop looking at Washington as the only thing that matters. Slide. Because the states are where the action is today on key policy and values issues. As national politics become increasingly polarized, how we live is going to be decided by local legislation. And what the states have been up to, particularly in Republican-dominated states, is aggressively expressing their disdain for democratic norms, federalism, the three levels of government, federal, state, and local, and for representative forms of government. Slide. And I'm going to talk particularly about one of the major tools they're using to accomplish this extreme agenda, and that is state preemption. State preemption is a legal tool that allows a higher level of government to limit or eliminate the power of a lower level of government from self-regulating. We're seeing this between the feds and the states right now in the fights over abortion, particularly mifepristone, and in the fights over immigration and fights over gun laws. But what we're going to focus today is the imposition of state will on local governments, on cities and towns. Next slide. Basically, preemption is a tool that's been around a long time. In the 70s, the tobacco industry realized it would be more efficient and effective for them to influence the regulation of their business, doing it at 50 state capitals instead of 13,000 city councils and towns. Next, this is the same playbook that was followed by the NRA when they pushed gun preemption laws across the country in the 80s. And as you can see, there are less than a handful of states that allow localities, local governments to regulate gun use, gun sales in their own jurisdictions. Next. So preemption's been around a while, basically used to fight regulation. But in 2010, there were convergence of three factors that really amplified the use and abuse of of preemption. And the convergence of these factors were money, muscle, and machine. In 2010, the US Supreme Court ruled in Citizens United and took the limits off corporate giving to federal races. They also, at the same time, took corporate giving limits off state races, which has had a huge impact because a little money goes a long way at the states in legislative races. In 2010, in fact, giving to state legislative races set a historic record. The outcome of the midterms also in 2010 brought a huge shift in power in state legislatures. Democrats lost 675 legislative seats. Republicans went from 9 to 21 trifectas. Today they have 28 trifectas, and trifectas are where one party controls both houses of the legislature and the governor's race. And they had a machine. They had ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which already had an agenda and a set of model bills ready to move when those new lawmakers took office in 2010. Slide. So I want to make sure everyone knows what ALEC is. Basically, this 50-year-old organization, which is a federal nonprofit, works with major industries to draft and share model legislation with its members, all conservative, anti-regulatory, pro-industry. About a quarter of all state legislators belong to ALEC. Between 2010 and 2018, almost 3,000 ALEC bills were introduced in 50 states. 600 of them passed. Those model bills included minimum wage preemption, paid sick, stand your ground, anti-sanctuary city, gun control bills, voter suppression laws, anti-public health regulatory bills, and it's stand your ground, which is now the law in 28 states. So if you ever wondered why you're seeing all these same bills everywhere at once, it's because of ALEC pushing this model language everywhere at the same time. What you see now also is a lot of anti-climate change bills. Some of the major members of ALEC are industry, including the petrochemical industry. And so you're seeing a lot of bills at the state level that really would weaken or repeal statewide efforts to control emissions and efficiency standards, to slash incentives on rooftop solar, eliminate tax breaks for electric vehicles, criminalize pipeline protests. Next slide. So what we have now since 2010 are what we call new preemption. And basically, these are sweeping state laws that clearly, intentionally, extensively, and at times punitively bar local efforts to address a host of local problems. What we've seen since 2010 is the use of the threat of criminal and civil penalties against lawmakers who are trying to move progressive legislation. This is all part of the same corruption and denial of democracy as gerrymandering, voter suppression, and ignoring the results of ballot measures. Next. Since 2010, we have seen an explosion in the quantity and scope of preemption laws. So in 2022, last year, more than 1,000 preemption bills were tracked by LSSC. That's an all-time high, and twice as many that moved in 2021. So far this year, we've already seen more than 620 preemption bills introduced or passed by state legislatures, just to give you an idea of how widely used this tool is. 469 of these bills were anti-LGBTQ bills, clearly organized targeting of queer and trans folk. 220 of those bills were focused on schools and education. We've also seen 150 restrictive voting laws that have been introduced or passed in 32 states. Slide. So this will give you an idea of how broadly these bills intended to restrict access to the polls and to limit and narrow the franchise, how widespread these are. Again, many of them written by ALEC. Next. The state is interfering in more policy areas. What we saw originally after 2010, when the use of preemption bills went on the increase, was focused primarily on workers' rights. That is expanded broadly. So we have 25 states that prohibit localities from increasing their minimum wage, that prohibit the adoption of paid sick days, that allow employees to earn paid sick leave. During the pandemic, 26 states actually weakened local public health authority and transferred the power to make public health decisions from public health experts to state politicians. These state lawmakers gave the power to state legislatures to decide vaccine regulations, masking regulations. We are seeing 10 states right now that are debating 27 election interference bills, bills that increase the opportunity for partisan interference in elections after people have voted. And progress on climate is also being forwarded at the state. 20 states now bar local governments from banning natural gas hookups, and 7 states have enacted laws banning local public entities from considering environmental, social, and governance factors before they invest local funds. Next, excuse me. Republican-controlled states are applying unprecedented tactics to shift social policies sharply to the right, not only within their borders, but across the nation. This is according to Ron Brownstein, who's pretty shrewd. And he has described what's going on at the states as building a nation within a nation, where the red states are setting up a set of rules for them to live by, and blue states will live by another set of rules. And you can see this in some of the bills that are now being considered this spring. 36 states now restrict education about race. 24 states have imposed bans on abortion or are likely to do so. 17 states are considering limits on local prosecutorial powers aimed at blocking criminal justice reform. 32 states bar local governments from imposing rental control. Next slide, please. So these are where the bans on teaching American history or restricting education on racism, bias, and the contributions of specific racial or ethnic groups to US history are barred. Next slide, please. So core powers of cities are being usurped. The voices of Black officials and voters being diluted. We're in a situation where minority rules. Traditionally, the powers that were given to local governments are now shifting over to state lawmakers. These include community zoning, housing regulations, school administration, municipal budgeting, particularly around police budgets. There will be no defunding the police, election administration, governance structure. I think you may have read about efforts by the Tennessee State Legislature to cut the size of the Nashville City Council in half from 40 to 20 members. Utilities regulation, public health authority, prosecutorial discretion. All of these were powers that once belonged to city councils and towns and counties, now have been taken over by the state. Next. I think many of you know that when people can't move legislation, they turn to the ballot. What you're also seeing is that those efforts stymied too. Preemption is being used to overturn ballot election results. So in Tempe, where you actually had 91% of the people there vote to enact a campaign finance disclosure law, it was overturned by the Arizona legislature. And legislatures in each of these states overturned laws that had been initiatives that had been approved by voters. So local hire law in Nashville, paid sick days in Wisconsin, fracking bans in Texas, non-discrimination ordinance in Arkansas. Next, please. Elections do matter. In Florida right now, lawmakers are considering a bill that will chill local lawmaking, designed to chill local lawmaking. It basically gives businesses in Florida the chance to sue governments and stop enforcements of ordinances they think halt their bottom line, that they call arbitrary and unreasonable ordinances. Unclear who defines what that is. The bill's sponsor labeled it as the preemption to end all government preemptions and says it's a much needed check on careless local rulemaking. Next. In Texas, lawmakers are considering what's being called a Death Star preemption bill that would, in one fell swoop, bar cities from passing regulations and overturning existing ones that go further than state law in broad swaths of area, including labor, agriculture, natural resources, and finance. This bill, it has very broad applications. I talked to a law school friend, professor, who says, this is basically an effort to get rid of constitutional home rule by statute. It's that broad. It undoes voter-approved paid sick days laws in San Antonio and Dallas. And as Nancy informed me, who will speak later in this, it will undo flood protections in Houston. This is part of a battle that's been waged for the past decade by Republican leaders in the legislature against Democratic-led cities in Texas. Next. Elections do matter in places where it's not dominated by the right-wing extreme agenda. Other things happen. In Michigan, for example, where they have the first governing trifecta in 40 years, the legislature has passed a gun control bill, repealed the state's abortion ban, enshrined protections for LGBTQ citizens, and repealed the right to work law, which made news recently. In Minnesota, lawmakers have guaranteed the right to an abortion, required that state utilities go carbon free by 2040, and made expanding voting rights a priority. There are 17 bills to increase access to the ballot in the houses at the legislature in Minnesota. Next. These red lawmakers basically are threatening, they're putting federalism and democracy in danger by their extreme agenda and their willingness to disrupt democracy. There is a power reshuffling that likely will have profound ramifications for questions of who decides and what they decide on many topics. It appears federalism is entering an intolerant terrain that threatens democracy itself. That was the conclusion of a report released last fall by the Brookings Institution. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kim. We're going to turn it over to Leader Reeves now.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on here. It is, you hear all that, and it gets a little disheartening, I can tell you that, but the good thing that I know that we've got going on in North Carolina is we're facing a lot of the same issues, a lot of the same problems. We're having a lot of ballot measures being pushed forward. One of those that are coming out this week is the constitutional carry measure. But the good news that we've got is that statewide, we have the numbers to defeat some of this stuff. Of course, we have the same problem that everybody else has with gerrymandering and things of that sort, but we do have the opportunity to do something statewide if we get folks turned out. And that's the biggest problem that we're facing, and the biggest issue that we're facing is making sure that we get turnout. What we found is we've had a Supreme Court that has turned Republican over the last couple of years. And of course, they've flexed those muscles by trying to give almost carte blanche to gerrymandering, but they've kept some things in place, thank goodness, that'll allow us to know what kind of maps we'll still be looking at, because we use county groupings, things of that sort. Because of those county groupings, we know that even with these new maps that they're going to draw, we still have an opportunity to stay out of a super minority, which is what we'll be pushing for this time. So that's a big issue. We've also got constitutional carry that's going to be on the ballot. They're looking for this year. We're hoping we can stop that in the House, but if we don't, that'll be something else that'll have us join 26 other states that have this on their ballot or have this as part of their law. But a lot of what you're seeing, as you've already heard stated, is aiming at local control, aiming to consolidate power in the General Assembly, aiming to take over our courts, aiming to take over our executive branch. And we've got to fight that. And that's really what our push has been so far, is to make sure that people know these things, which I think, number one, especially if you heard the prior presentation, if we were able to get that information out to people and really get it widely distributed, I think that you'll have people who want to support us and want to be there for us. But I think that's the big issue that we've got to work on, is making sure that we, in fact, are able to get that information out, because a lot of folks just don't recognize what they're voting for.
Thank you so much, Leader. And we're going to turn it over to Kim Rogers.
Thank you. And thank you all for having me. It's great to be with my fellow speakers and already learned so much. So I'm gonna start on a really positive message, because folks are finally paying attention to work in the states. Folks on this call obviously understand it, but in the aftermath of 2020, when we saw what happened on January 6th, when we saw the efforts that Trump was willing to go to lie about the election results, we decided that DAS really needed to stand up and ensure that we had pro-democracy, pro-voter secretaries of state in all of these key states as we looked into 2024. And as Paige mentioned at the beginning, we had an incredibly successful year. We defeated election deniers in every single battleground state. You all may have seen it this morning already. States United Action just came out with a study. There was an election denier penalty of anywhere between 2.3 and 3.7 points. And I think that reiterates what we have said over and over, that voters do care about democracy. Democracy may be a word that means a little bit different to all of us, but when it comes down to it, voters want to know that their votes are counted and they want to feel empowered. And letting folks know how their elections work and who runs their election was actually a key part of what we did. And frankly, part of our path to victory. You know, we got in really early to leverage some of that earned media. We did oppo to define our opponents, as well as like introduce our candidates. We kept democracy on the forefront, telling voters that they mattered. It's going to continue to be an issue. I think we've seen voting rights continue to be attacked. And early in 21, as we were federally focused on voting rights bill, we were able to stay up and say, hey, we run the elections in the state. This is incredibly important. And we did educational opportunities with the folks who were writing these stories to insert secretaries of state into the conversation, and frankly, to insert our opponents in their opposition to it. I think another thing that we learned as we were talking about is saying someone is extreme, saying someone is an election denier means different things to different people. And everyone's like, oh, it's extreme. This is just a back and forth. We got into it where we used their own words against them as much as possible. Video, audio, we took when Jim Marchant in Nevada said, if I were Secretary of State, Donald Trump would still be president. I can make Donald Trump president if you elect me. Less blatant on the election denialism, but Christina Caramo also had some of my favorite things. And if you ever want to talk about demonic possession and whether or not it's real, we have some quotes for that as well. But I think the most important thing is we really communicated with voters. We got out there. We used some of our affiliated C4 primary purpose to explain what secretaries of state actually do, why it's important, who these people are, and how democracy is attached to every other freedom that we care about. And we used it to define our candidates versus their candidates, gave voters a clear choice, a clear contrast between competence and chaos. And now what? Because of that, By winning in every battleground state, Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, we know that we will have fairly, safely, securely administered elections in those states. And as there is a ton of turnover amongst county election directors and clerks, we will have Democratic, pro-democracy secretaries of state advising, administering these elections, issuing guidance, training these county officials on how the elections run, and we can guarantee that they will certify the election. And not only that, I know that Kim was talking about some of the terrible preemption, but our secretaries in places like Michigan, in Minnesota, in New Mexico, have had such huge success working with the state legislators to pass pro-voter, pro-democracy legislation. We are putting in greater automatic voter registration, expanding vote by mail, expanding same-day registration, ensuring that folks have access to the ballot, bringing back returning Americans, restore rights restoration, and frankly, protecting election workers. As we come into 2024, the election denier in chief is currently leading the Republican race. We know that we're going to continue to hear massive amounts of disinformation, but now we have secretaries, election administrators who can stand up, be trusted messengers, say, you're going to hear a lot of bullshit about these elections, but I run elections, and let me tell you all the checks and balances that exist and why your ballot is safe and secure. And that is a huge thing that we didn't have in all of these states in 2020. So we are centering ourselves to be part of the conversation and preserving democracy, and frankly, to push back on all the disinformation that is out there as we move into this portion of the campaign. And happy to answer any questions as we go on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kim. And our final presentation this afternoon is from Nancy Zadunkowicz. Nancy, take it away.
Great. Hi, everybody. So I'm Nancy Zadunkowicz. I'm a founder of Z-Day Research. I am a pollster. I'm excited to share with you my knowledge about winning state ledge races while I get this queued up really quickly. I've worked on over 200 state ledge races in the past couple of years. So I have some ideas about what works and some ideas about what I think we could do better that I would like to share. So first of all, just to level set, I think state ledge races are actually the hardest races to win. It's harder to get your message out. It's way more of like an information battle than anywhere else. I think we could just all benefit from a lot more investment and attention in state ledge races. So I want to thank Paige for, in general, shining the light on this area. This year, again, abortion is on the ballot. I think it's on the ballot everywhere. Dobbs changed the game. And I want to thank everybody who listened when we told people that this issue is salient now. By the way, even in places like Delaware last year, where we grew the majority in the Senate, we were worried this wasn't going to be a major issue because abortion rights were more secure there, but it was still the top reason to oppose a Republican candidate in virtually every race that I could think of. It was a top reason to oppose a Republican candidate. It said something about how extreme they were. And again, it mattered this year more than it did in other years. And you might think, okay, well, we just had this election where abortion was the issue. We didn't actually make progress in some states. Well, just because we didn't flip some seats last cycle doesn't mean that they aren't on the table in 2023, 2024. So first of all, we're talking about a general election universe now. And second, a lot of Republicans avoided scrutiny for their abortion views. And now that Roe has been turned, they can't. And again, before Dobbs, there was a salience problem. But since then, many of these states have voted on new abortion laws. So we're able to speak to their votes. By the way, it's not just going to be abortion. We need to let voters know where they're coming on birth control and IVF and Plan B. Number two, I think we need to do a better job of telling the story of what Republicans are doing while they're in session, where they're in charge, and then what Democrats are doing where they have control. So Republicans, they're doing crazy stuff right now, as we heard about. It's hard to know where to even start other than, abortion. So I think we need to do more investment in session and post-session polling so that we can come up with that compelling story about the Republicans and their priorities. And then we need to work harder to spread that message. And then where we do have a governing majority, we need to tell the positive story about what we're doing. There are, especially labor does do a lot of session polling, and it's so important, and I think we need more of it. And the reason I think that it's so important to have that research is because I think the things that get the most attention are the things, or the things maybe we think are the most dangerous, are not necessarily the things that are going to be the most politically impactful. And remember, we're trying to flip or hold gerrymandered districts. So not everything is going to be like as clear cut as abortion is going to be. The good news is a lot of what they're trying to do is unpopular. We just need to know what to focus on, and polling can really help with that. So for example, in Iowa, I don't think it's going to be the child labor laws or like removing a book that's going to get people to switch their votes. I think it's going to be more like explaining to them how much money got taken from their child's school because of their school voucher program that just went through. I've also been frustrated in the lack of an overall economic narrative in many of these states. I think that's something that we can invest in. Have an alternative narrative, and they need to be state specific. It's not just the issues that are going to be different in different states too. It's also true in different parts of states. So I think we need to focus on the issues that matter to your area, to your race. So like if you're in Chester County, Pennsylvania, open spaces are more important. Or if you're in like some parts of Delaware, senior care is more important. And the list goes on. If you're like in working class neighborhoods, maybe some social issues are less important, but the social safety net's more important. By the way, some of the issues that people care about aren't necessarily things that people think of when they think of this, what the state's responsible for. So for example, climate change, it's often a top issue of importance nationally for Democrats, but it's not something people think of when they think about, the states. So, I routinely find that it's not something that's helpful to talk about in my state-led races. In addition to kind of tailoring to your district and to your region, remember we're in a general election cycle now. We're competing with national headlines for attention. So it's really important that we're disciplined and that we're staying focused on our story and our races. And no one's going to do that hard work for us. In general, we need to be personalizing what's happening in these state legislatures. We need to connect the dots. We need to raise the stakes. We need to show how it is the Republican majority is, leading to higher property taxes by their policies, or how their education agenda is undermining public schools in their area, or highlight the real ways in which women are hurting because of their abortion policies. We need to people need to see like how their lives are materially changed, or someone that they know how their life is materially changed for the worse because of what they're doing. Same thing goes for Democrats in places where we now have a majority. We have to run on those accomplishments, right? But the problem is that it's not as simple as say like, oh, here's the stimulus check you got in the mail. Like, I wish everything was that easy. We have to connect the dots, because no one's really going to be able to. It's hard, I think, for people to feel the results of any one piece of legislation. All right, next slide. We really need to make it easier for people to have, for our candidates to reach people, to raise their name ID, to raise trust in who they are as Democrats. Here's the reason this is so important. First of all, base Democratic constituencies are the most likely to drop off down ballot because they don't feel like they know somebody. Second, in swing districts, the generic Democrat does not get the benefit of the doubt. So like I have a hard time thinking about races where like if we were over 30% favorability before we started spending serious money, like those were seats that we won. Clearly this is going to be more difficult in the red to blue districts. You're starting from nothing in most cases, unless you're like a popular local figure. But Also, remember, there are Democrats who are running for the first time in state races, in state leg districts that have changed because of redistricting. And so they may have gotten to the low-hanging fruit in 2022, but now it's a general election universe. And so they have to reach some folks who they haven't introduced themselves to before. So everybody's going to be trying to do this. You're also competing again with the general election cycle. So it's even harder to get attention. I want candidates to be have the funding to be able to create much more content, to tell the story of who they are to voters, and then to understand that the media ecosystem right now is so fractured. The way in which people actually consume media and entertainment and information is, again, so fractured. And we really need to mirror that, and we need to be producing content that we are distributing to all the different places where people are going to get media, information, entertainment. Now, this might sound counterintuitive based on what I just told you about how important it was for us to be able to introduce people to folks, but I do not buy the conventional wisdom anymore that you shouldn't name your opponent when they have low name ID. Generic Republicans, they get the benefit of the doubt in swing districts, especially in places like Pennsylvania, Illinois, New Jersey, et cetera, where people, proudly declare that they are, ticket splitters, especially if, you have someone who's going to intend to vote for the Democrat at the top of the ticket. That was our biggest fear in Pennsylvania last year, was all the people who considered themselves like independents. They're open to voting for a Democrat or Republican. They say they're ticket splitters. They were going to vote for the Democrats at the top of the ticket. And we were concerned, well, this might be where they show, I'm not a, one party voter. We have to say, so this Republican is a bad one. And I would rather raise their name ID than risk swing voters making the wrong assumption about them. By the way, there's a reason why Republicans are increasingly not campaigning at all in some of these races, because they know that they'll have to justify their positions, and they don't want scrutiny, but they know that they can get do better by just completely staying off the board, which is sad. 7, we need to get people on the record on issues where we think that we can do the most damage. And I want to shout out to what we were talking about earlier with the amount of research that went into those Secretary of State races. Again, we need this at the state level too. The good news is that some Republicans now, they really can't help but tell us exactly what they think. And Republicans can't help but nominate some of the people who are the craziest, more than willing to tell us everything controversial that has ever popped into their mind. But in the tougher races, candidates were smart enough to say avoid a questionnaire. It would have been so helpful to have a tracker who would have tracked them down and got them to say something inartful on some of the issues that we knew that were important. If they're not going to put themselves out there and the press isn't going to do their job, then we need to put the scrutiny on them. And this will help us stop being on defense, I think. And the messages that we featured quotes from candidates on, those had more impact. They were more powerful. And so that's why it's really important and helpful to have those things. Also, there are, in some of these state leg districts where Republicans have been able to hold on in places where say they don't like the Republican majority, but they think I like my Republican state legislator. I think it's hard for them because they think they know this person. It's hard for us to break through that. And so I think this is a really helpful way of how we can do that. There are a couple of things I think we should really pin them down on. And one of them is abortion. So do they support exceptions for rape and incest, life of the mother? Do they want to cut off access to IVF, to contraception, to Plan B? Do they think women should be punished for receiving an abortion? But I also think we can, push them to say inartful things about, say, education funding or the economy. There's a lot of opportunity here. And again, using their words against them is going to be particularly powerful. Finally, people keep forgetting we are in gerrymandered districts. If you're in a Trump-won district, it is not going to help you to connect a candidate to Trump. If you're, talking about maybe a statewide candidate who's unpopular, but in that district, they don't have, it's not clear that, that they're going to lose that district, then you shouldn't be trying to connect them to that, statewide, candidate or any other figure. If we haven't seen in the survey that there's a large majority who disapprove of them or aren't going to support them. So just be careful about who your villain is. Remember, we are fighting in most of these places uphill in gerrymandered districts. So with that, I will turn it back over to Paige.
Thank you guys. This was great. I want to emphasize as we go forward into 2024, where most of the attention or a lot of the attention is going to be paid to the presidential and then federal races, just how important these state races are, because this is where people's lives are really impacted the most. And we're seeing that in state after state after state, and the stakes could not be higher. So as we go through 2024, I'm going to keep reminding people to pay attention to what's going on in the states. And particularly, as Kim has noted, I mean, if we don't have secretaries of states who value respecting voting rights and people's ability to elect their representatives, that's just so fundamental to our democracy. So with that, let me open it up for questions. I'm sure there are a lot, and this has been this has been really helpful and really informative. So let's open it up for questions.
Thanks, Paige. First, I wanted to start with any questions that our speakers have for each other. Nope, there are none. Hearing none. Okay, Nancy, the first question from the audience is for you. Laura is wondering if you have experience using materials developed by Demcast, or are their materials too general to be useful in state legislative races?
I have not, but I'm happy to check it out. Typically, we're doing doing research ourselves. You have somebody who's produced your research book. I'm conducting the state session polling or something like that for folks, and then trying to distribute that. But it's I think it would be helpful to have more resources. So thank you for flagging that for me. I'll check it out.
Thanks, Nancy. And there's another question for you here in the Q&A, but I'm gonna let you go ahead and answer that directly if you'd like to type in your answer. Okay. We also have been asking this question of all of our speakers throughout the series this year, and I'll give it to you first, Kim Haddow. What is the thing that you're seeing that people are not asking or talking about enough? I think your whole presentation is probably your answer, but if you have a more specific example that you want to share with the audience, we'd love to hear it. And this will be the same question for all of you.
I think that there's a very basic, the split that's going on. Some of what's going on is about personal freedom and autonomy. So whether it's about abortion, who reads what books, what's taught in classrooms, who votes, who decides who votes. I think a lot of this is really about, it's not about the power that politicians have. It's about the sort of agency you have over your own life. And at the bottom line, what is happening here, it isn't about the fight between states and local governments. Who cares, except that it comes into your front door, right? And determines the quality of your life and healthcare and civic life and your children's education. So I think that part of just how close it's coming to people's lives is terrifying, and people need to pay more attention to that.
Thanks, Kim. And Leader Reeves, I'm going to turn that question to you next. If you're still with us, I see your microphone is open, so that's awesome. What are the questions that people aren't asking? What are you hearing from your constituents in the day-to-day of your work?
Well, really, it goes back to one of the other speakers and what they were talking about, in the sense of we don't at all talk about the bad things they're doing. Everybody feels that their own Republican legislator is Ms. or Mr. Great Guy, great girl, great woman. And they're not asking, how are these people voting on these issues? What is the end game? What are we trying to do? And I think it was an excellent point to discuss the fact that the media doesn't talk about it. There are things that happen, that are bills that are filed and get support that are kind of shocking, and nobody ever talks about it. And so I think that overall, what I hear from constituents is when I give reports about, hey, these are some of the bills these guys are trying to pass. Hey, this is the reason you don't have broadband. I was at one of the counties in my district is incredibly Republican. It's the reddest district in the entire state, or reddest county rather in the entire state. And I had to join them for a luncheon with their chamber, which would normally not be the best place for a Democrat to show up. And the hot button issue with all of them was, what in the world are you thinking voting against Medicaid expansion? Because Randolph County had almost lost its hospital, and they're saying, you've got a chance to save our hospital and you're voting against it, and nobody can give good answers. So I feel, as the speakers have talked, if we can get that information out there, we're doing fine. But I think in terms of the questions people are asking, I think there are tons of questions that aren't getting asked because we're not giving the cues that folks need. And I'm not saying that blaming, because we're having that same problem too. We don't have the money, we don't have the resources, but that's what we've got to do. And what we've worked on in North Carolina is trying to combine our resources so that we're working with our state party, our Senate caucus, with the partners and IEs to try to all of us say the same thing and maybe get it amplified.
Thank you so much. And a quick follow-up, I'm going to invite you to say a little bit more about how you are reaching people. What are some of the most effective ways that you're connecting with folks with the messages, understanding the limitations on resources?
Well, I tell you, nothing works like taking advantage of earned media opportunities. It's bad that the news always wants something that's going to get clicks, but the truth of the matter is people like seeing their legislator on TV, and they like hearing their legislator on radio interviews. So what we've done is try to encourage all of our folks to take advantage of it. I know that it gets everybody nervous and it makes them not want to do it, but the truth of the matter is a lot of the media reporters themselves are kind of leaning our way. They just don't report our way. And so they're not hitting you with gotcha questions, and they're giving you an opportunity to really state your platform. Another thing that we've done is try to get a lot more active with social media, of course, like everybody would, but try to do it more in a concise way that attracts viewers. We've got some younger people on the staff, and so one of the things they talk about all the time are getting videos out there, getting pictures out there, something that makes somebody want to stop and hear what you're saying. And of course, the bottom line is good old shoe leather. We're incredibly lucky in this state as Democrats to have groups like Neighbors on Call, County to County, who canvass almost all year long, and they offer you opportunities. And in fact, one of them offered me an opportunity to do a canvass with our Hispanic neighbors in August. And taking advantage of those opportunities really means something, because not only do people appreciate the fact you're knocking on their doors, but they appreciate seeing something posted on social media saying you were out there doing that. So those are the things I think we've been most effective with.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. Kim Rogers, same question for you. What are the things that we're not asking? What's the low-hanging fruit?
Oh, I mean, I'm going to say two of my favorite things that people don't think about very often. States and counties and municipalities administer all federal elections, and they are not funded to do that. So I think that is an ongoing battle, but regular structured funding for election infrastructure, because that is how we will determine who is elected across all of our federal offices as well. And I think the other piece that folks aren't talking about from 2022 is that in most of our states, the Secretary of State outperformed the top of the ticket. And in some states, we're even the top vote getter, securing more votes than governors. And I think a big thing about that is because we made it about democracy, about empowering voters, about telling them that they mattered. And again, leaned into that clear contrast. We had competent, steady leaders. They were agents of chaos and conspiracy. We named that. We defined them before they could define themselves. And because we were so focused on the fundamental freedoms and empowering voters, that we actually saw that work. And, it got us more votes than the top of the ticket in a lot of states.
Thank you. Kim Haddow, this question is for you from Liz. Liz is wondering if states have time before the 2024 election to overcome some of the barriers that are now being put in to register enough new voters and work on turnout before the doors are shut. Liz says they're in Texas.
Oh, well, I'm not an expert on the Texas voting law. Maybe Kim Rogers can help me here. But what I do know is I think 2 years ago, they passed an extreme set of restrictions on everything from drive-through voting to voting by mail, voter ID bills. I think they have a ban on third-party registration. Kim, do you know if that's true? Basically, Texas has some of the most restrictive voting laws, again, designed to keep, this is a red, overwhelmingly white legislature designed to keep Black and brown people voting in democratically led progressive cities. So do I know technically if you have enough time? I'm going to say before 2024, yes. But I do think that they are definitely trying to stack the rejigger the rules so it makes it harder. So the earlier you can go register, the better. Just go get it done.
Yeah, I mean, this goes into what Kim was talking about earlier in terms of preemption. The state legislature has made it very hard for Dallas County, Harris County, Travis County, where Austin is, to register voters to have additional drop boxes to do vote by mail. And, they are incredibly restrictive, but there are a lot of groups on the ground in Texas doing the work. There are people paying attention to Texas who understand how important it is. And voter suppression is not new. A lot of these Black and brown groups have been working against voter suppression for decades and have showed up and turned out. And the importance of this election is continuing to build upon the importance of past elections. And I think that's deeply felt in these communities. And I think the groups on the ground are going to do the work that it takes in states like Texas.
I also want to point out, I think having an understanding of exactly what is going on and the barriers that are being set up now, because if we don't start early in terms of activity, early in terms of funding, everything, understanding how to get around some of these barriers. I mean, they can be gotten around. It's just harder and harder, and it takes earlier and earlier work and earlier money.
Thanks, Paige. Did you have any more questions that you wanted to ask of our speakers before we wrap it up?
No, I just want to thank you. It's very interesting to me. I'll make one comment. The irony is that what's happening in state legislative bodies and the Secretary of State's races, and I think Kim and her work in 2022 addressed it. These are some of the lowest information races, and voters have less information about these races than many, many other races. And it's particularly acute now because of increasing news deserts and the lack of local news. So you're seeing this intersection of low information races, lower information voters because of that, news deserts. And I think that really calls upon us to figure out what are the new strategies and tactics that we need to begin thinking about and adopting in an operating environment that is very, very different from what we have been in the past.
Thank you so much. Any final words from you, Kim Rogers, Kim Haddow, Nancy, or Leader Reeves?
Thanks to all my fellow speakers and to Paige and everyone for putting this together. It's always so fun to hear smart people talk about things we care about.
Well said. Well said. Thank you all for joining us today. We have another webinar, actually bonus webinar coming up this month that I think you all will really enjoy. It's a follow-up with Christopher Parker and Tom Bonnier. We'll be taking a look at their research on Black voters, which relates to this conversation and all conversations, of course. I've popped the link into the chat, and we hope that we'll see you back here in a couple of weeks. Thanks to all of our speakers once again, and to everybody in the audience for joining us today. And for those of you who are watching online, after the fact, we appreciate you as well. Stay well, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank
you
you
very much.